Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today I want to take you along on a search. Last time we established that hope isn't a soft feeling. It's closer to a calculation, your nervous system's running estimate of whether action is still worth taking, which raises an obvious next question, and it's one researchers have genuinely chased. If hope is that real, where is it? Is there a place in the brain where hope lives? A circuit that holds it, that could be found, protected, maybe someday repaired? Can a nervous system, as a physical object, actually lose hope, the way it can lose the ability to move a hand? I want to warn you gently that this episode goes into some serious territory, including illness and suicide risk, and I'm going to handle that carefully. If you're in a fragile place today, it's completely fine to skip this one or to come back to it another time. Nothing here is going anywhere. So here's our stride. First, what happens when scientists go looking for hope in the brain? Then, a remarkable experiment that failed, and why the failure taught us more than a success would have. Then what happens to hope in people whose nervous systems are genuinely damaged, which is where this stops being abstract. Then a finding that reorganized how I think about despair entirely. And finally, what all this means for anyone who has ever felt hope drain out of them and wondered whether it was gone for good. Let's take the first step. Start with the search, because researchers have looked and they have found something. Hope and hopelessness show up in the brain. They have signatures. That's not in dispute. In one study using a brain imaging technique called MEG, researchers examined people who had recently been through a suicidal crisis. Those individuals showed the highest levels of hopelessness in the sample, and that hopelessness was associated with reduced activity in what's called the salience network, a system built around the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. Those are regions we've met before on this show. The insula is the great interpreter of bodily feeling. The cingulate helps decide what deserves your attention and effort. In major depression, hopelessness has been found to correlate inversely with the availability of dopamine transporters across the basal ganglia, which is to say, hopelessness tracked with the state of the reward and motivation machinery, exactly as you'd expect from everything we covered last week. In bipolar disorder, lower engagement of a region called the medial orbitofrontal cortex during emotion regulation was associated with greater hopelessness, and specifically with the loss of motivation component of it. And there's a thread I find especially telling. Studies of people at risk of suicide find difficulty in generating positive future experiences, not just feeling bad about the future, struggling to imagine it in any specific or vivid way. And that difficulty tracked with reduced activation in frontal regions during positive future thinking. Sit with that. Not the future looks bad. Something more like the future has gone blank. The imaginative machinery that would populate it with anything worth walking toward has quieted down. I think that's a much more accurate picture of despair than the one we usually carry. We picture despair as a dark forecast. This research suggests it may be closer to an empty one. So the brain is clearly involved, the signatures are real, and they've replicated across different methods in different populations. But here's where the story turns and where science does the thing I most admire about it. Somebody actually tested the Hope Center hypothesis directly, and it failed. Here's the setup, and it's poignant. Patients with brain metastases often receive radiation to the whole brain, which can damage cognition. So a technique was developed to avoid the hippocampus during that radiation, protecting it, because the hippocampus is central to memory and to imagining the future. And if hope lives anywhere, if there were a plausible seat for it, the hippocampus would be a leading candidate precisely because you can't hope for a future you can't imagine. So researchers ran a trial. Would sparing the hippocampus preserve patients' hope better than standard treatment? It did not. Hippocampal avoidance did not protect hope. The Hope Center, if it exists, was not there. And I want to make a case for why that negative result is one of the most valuable findings in this entire body of research. Because it means hope is not a room in the house. It's not a lamp that a surgeon could shield. When we look for a single seed of hope in the nervous system, the evidence keeps saying it's not here either. Frontal regions, salience networks, reward systems, future imagery circuits, all of them participate, and none of them is the thing itself. Hope in the brain is distributed. It's a property of a system working together, not an organ you could point to, which sounds like a disappointment and is actually, I think, quietly good news. And I'll come back to why at the end. Now, let's go to the place where this stops being abstract, because there are people whose nervous systems are genuinely physically damaged, and we can ask directly what happens to their hope. The findings are sobering, and I don't want to soften them. In multiple sclerosis, a disease in which the immune system attacks the nervous system, researchers looked at people in the early stage of the relapsing remitting form. Not advanced, early, and they found that roughly 2/3 of them reported moderate to severe hopelessness. 2/3, early on, often with low physical disability, which tells you something crucial. The hopelessness was not simply proportional to how damaged their bodies were, it was riding on something else, on the uncertainty, on the threatening interpretation of the illness, on not knowing when the next relapse would come or what it would take. Remember the controllability finding from last episode. Hope tracks controllable futures, and a relapsing remitting disease is almost a machine for destroying the sense that outcomes are controllable. You do everything right, and it relapses anyway. The evidence that your actions matter gets systematically undermined by the disease's own structure. The pattern shows up elsewhere too. In stroke survivors, hope protects quality of life, and the loss of hope tracks with functional impairment, stress, and the availability of social support. In people with central nervous system cancers, one study found that language barriers and needing an interpreter were associated with lower hope. Read that one again because it's extraordinary, not the tumor, the interpreter, which tells you that hope in a hospital is being built or destroyed partly in the conversation, in whether the person can understand what's happening to them, ask their questions, and be met. That's not a footnote to the medicine. On this evidence, it may be part of it. And there's a finding from brain tumor research that surprised me. Hope and distress were not associated with the stage of the tumor. The biological severity of the disease did not determine the state of the person's hope, which brings the whole thing into focus. Hope is not simply a readout of how bad your situation is. Now, I want to give you the finding that reorganized my thinking, and I'd hand it to every clinician I know. We assume hope and hopelessness are one dial. Turn hope down and hopelessness comes up. Two ends of one stick. The research says no. Hope and hopelessness appear to be statistically distinct, not simple opposites. And in one study, hope was found to buffer the impact of hopelessness on suicidal ideation. Sit with what that means because it's not a technicality. It means you can hold both. It means a person can be genuinely, deeply hopeless about their situation and still carry some hope, and the hope is still doing work. It's not canceled out, it's still protecting them. Two dials, not one. And it means something practically enormous, which is that the goal is not necessarily to eliminate someone's hopelessness. You may not be able to, and demanding it may be cruel, but you might be able to add something on the other channel, a small piece of agency, one visible pathway, one thing worth walking toward. You don't have to talk someone out of the dark to hand them something in it. I want to pause here because we've been in heavy territory, and I want to speak directly for a moment. If any of this is describing where you are right now, if the future has gone blank rather than dark, if you can't picture anything worth walking toward, I want you to hear that this is a recognized state, that it is studied, and that it is treatable. It's not a fact about your future, it's a state of a system, and states change. Please talk to someone, a doctor, a therapist, someone you trust. And if things feel acute, please reach out to a crisis line where you are, because that's exactly what they're there for. I'd be glad to help you find the right one if you ask. Now, let me pull this together, because there's an answer to the question in the title, and it's more interesting than yes or no. Can your nervous system lose hope? The honest answer is your nervous system participates in hope deeply and measurably, but it does not contain hope as a single thing that can be switched off. There's no organ to lose. What the research finds instead is distributed vulnerability. Many systems contribute, and hope degrades when several of them are strained at once. The reward machinery that estimates whether effort is worth spending, the salient system that decides what matters, the imaginative machinery that populates a future, the stress systems that push toward shutdown. So hope doesn't get deleted, it gets starved from several directions at once. And now let me tell you why the failed Hope Center experiment is, to me, the most hopeful thing in this entire episode. If hope lived in one place, then damage to that place would be the end of it. There'd be a lesion that took your hope and there'd be nothing to be done. But a distributed thing cannot be destroyed by a single blow. It can be undermined from many directions, which is bad, but it can also be supported from many directions, which is the whole point. There is no single point of failure, and therefore there is no single point of no return, which is precisely why the interventions we know about work in so many different registers. You can support hope through the body, through movement and sleep, since those feed the reward and stress systems. You can support it through the environment by removing the conditions that keep proving your actions don't matter. You can support it through relationships, and remember from last episode that hope is substantially relational, computed with people, which is why an interpreter in a cancer ward turned out to matter. And you can support it through experience, through small completed acts that supply the evidence the estimate is built from. Four doors again, same as always on this show, and there's real evidence the door opens. Reviews of positive psychological interventions in neurological disorders find improvements in quality of life and in depressive symptoms. Researchers are actively developing hope focused and emotion regulation focused interventions for people whose nervous systems are unwell. It isn't a solved problem, and the trials are still uneven, and I won't oversell it. But hope in a damaged nervous system is being treated as modifiable, and that is not nothing. So here's what I want you to carry out of this one. Your nervous system can be starved of hope. That's real, and it's not your fault. And it can happen to a brain that is doing nothing wrong. Chronic uncertainty will do it. Illness will do it. An environment that keeps demonstrating that your actions don't matter will do it, and do it efficiently. But hope was never sitting in one place, waiting to be taken from you. It was always distributed, always being rebuilt, always the product of a system doing its ongoing arithmetic on the evidence available. And a distributed thing has this property, which I find genuinely consoling. It can be fed from anywhere. You don't have to find the room where your hope is kept because there isn't one. You only have to start putting evidence back into the system from the body, from the room, from the people, from one small thing that works. The arithmetic never stopped running. It's still there, still waiting for new numbers. That's the stride from the empty future towards something you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.